I knew something was wrong the second I walked into the break room and heard the new VP say, "She still uses paper binders. What is this, 1983? They were all laughing. Him, the shiny new strategic transformation analyst he'd plucked off LinkedIn, and the HR intern who thought FOIA was a skincare brand. They didn't even pause when I stepped in. I just grabbed my lukewarm coffee, smiled that quiet smile women learn to perfect in corporate trenches, and mentally calculated how long it would take for the entire building to collapse under the weight of a compliance audit. The truth was, my binders could bury this place. I'd spent 17 years in that corner office with no windows, weaving the legal backbone of this company like a federal surgeon with nerves of ice. Every contract with FEMA, the USDA, Homeland Security, even the Bureau of Prisons had my signature embedded somewhere deep in the paperwork's DNA. My name was the quiet watermark behind every dollar this company ever made off the government. I was the registered contracting officer for every single file that mattered. I could recite federal audit cycles the way most people recite nursery rhymes. I knew Title 48 like scripture, clause numbers like birthdays, and how to fold a non-compliance waiver so tight it looked like origami. I danced with more auditors than I'd had vacation days. But in a company that measured worth by Slack reactions and happy hour selfies, that didn't count. My precision was invisible currency. 17 years of quiet vigilance, and suddenly I was an artifact. That was fine. I'd seen trends come and go. I'd survived 3 CEOs, 2 restructures, and 1 acquisition that almost dissolved us into digital dust. They all learned eventually, you don't touch federal compliance without gloves. Then came Brad, or rather, Blake Morrison, Vice President of Operations and Human Evolution, as he called himself. Loud, polished, full of TED Talk phrases and bad cologne. He'd spent his last decade in tech, which meant he believed bureaucracy was optional and rules were legacy friction. First day, he joked about unclogging bureaucratic arteries. Second day, he sat in my chair and called my office the relic room. I smiled. Let the toddler wear the crown. By day 3, he was sending memos about compliance modernization and real-time oversight integration. The kind of buzzword salad that sounds impressive to executives who don't understand it. Slowly, the oxygen changed. Emails stopped CCing me. Procurement used templates I didn't recognize. My federal portal access was under maintenance. One morning, I walked into a meeting, and my name was gone from the agenda. In its place, Blake Morrison, Acting Contract Officer. I asked when the reassignment had been approved. He chuckled, God, that smug little chuckle, and said, "We streamlined that last week. You're still looped in, just not the gatekeeper anymore. You're not cleared for federal work anyway, right?" I could have broken a pen in half and driven it through his arrogance. Instead, I sipped my burnt penny coffee and smiled, because I knew something he didn't. You can't just remove a federally registered contract officer like you're rearranging office chairs. It starts a clock. A very loud, very official clock. Tick. Tock. The meeting dragged on for another 30 minutes of buzzwords and performative synergy. Blake strutted in front of the screen, sleeves rolled, vape tucked behind his ear like a prop. "We need to disrupt ourselves before someone else does," he said, and I swear I felt my soul leave my body. Then came the grenade. "Well, Dana's not even cleared for federal work anymore, so we'll be reevaluating that whole process." I froze mid-sip. The room went silent. Legal blinked, HR smiled politely. I swallowed hard and said, "Actually, my clearance is current through to 6, renewed every 24 months by federal background check. I'm guessing your recent change of residence might delay yours." The air cracked. His laugh came out a beat too fast. "Sure, but that's just paperwork," he said. "What we need is fresh energy." I didn't argue. I didn't have to. Because while he was performing, I was remembering something important. Section 4.3b of the Federal Acquisition Regulations. Remove a registered contracting officer without federal reassignment, and the contract enters automatic audit risk within 10 business days. He thought he'd replaced me. He'd actually armed me. That afternoon, I went back to my desk, the same cubicle that had weathered more audits than half the executive team combined, and opened the Federal Contractor Registry. My name, Dana Ellison, Contracting Officer of Record, was still there. Every file, every clearance, every active contract under my authorization. Then I saw it. The new $480 million defense logistics contract. In my place, under designated officer, it now read Blake Morrison, acting. Acting, indeed. Acting like this was a school play and the Department of Defense didn't care who held the pen. There was no reassignment form, no agency acknowledgement, no clearance confirmation. Just a lazy internal substitution like it was a Slack admin change, not a federal appointment governed by Title 48. I took a screenshot, printed it, and pulled out the hard copy of the original filing. My signature. Legal's countersignature, the CEO's, no replacement on record, which meant the contract was now in limbo, non-compliant and exposed. I didn't yell. I didn't even sigh. I simply opened the Federal Contract Registry portal and filed a change notification. I used the driest, most surgical phrasing in my vocabulary. Contracting Officer of Record removed internally without corresponding federal reassignment, requesting compliance verification per subsection 4.3b. Once submitted, the system stamped it with a timecode. 1807 Eastern clock started. Then I printed that confirmation too, hole-punched it, and slid it into a new binder labeled in bold Sharpie. Blake Morrison, Audit Prep. I knew what would come next. Federal systems move slow, like tectonic plates, but when they shift, they make mountains crumble. Blake was still strutting through the halls, talking about lean frameworks and adaptive compliance ecosystems. He even held a town hall with a PowerPoint titled, Reimagining Compliance for the Future. I nearly choked on my protein bar when I read that. Reimagining compliance, like the federal acquisition regulation was a Pixar reboot. He dismissed seasoned staff, reassigned oversight roles to interns, and sent out an email that read, Effective immediately, the compliance department will transition to an agile model, reducing redundancy, accelerating approvals, and empowering cross-functional integration. Translation: gut the department and let untrained analysts handle contracts worth hundreds of millions. Then the kicker. Special thanks to Dana Ellison for her years of service. We wish her continued success in her new supportive role. Supportive role? As if I were some administrative mascot. I didn't reply. Didn't flinch. Because by then, the first whisper of movement came from the machine. An automated federal response landed in my inbox. Notification received. Review cycle initiated per 4.3b. 10 business days. Tick. I closed the email, poured another cup of burnt coffee, and began cataloging everything. Access logs, timestamps, authorization revocations. Every login Blake made after locking me out left a trace. I documented them all. Screenshots, IP addresses, internal memos, each page another nail in his coffin. I printed everything, filed it neatly, and labeled the next section of my binder. Unauthorized actions, pending audit. He had no clue. He thought I'd gone quietly, that I was too old school, too analog to fight back. What he didn't understand was that my silence was never weakness. It was strategy. I'd been underestimated for 17 years, and it was finally about to pay off. When HR sent the official notice confirming my realignment, I framed it next to my federal clearance certificate. The irony was delicious. I stayed late that night, the office empty except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the cleaning crew dragging vacuums down the hall. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a quiet, electric calm. He'd started a chain reaction he couldn't stop. The rules were already sharpening themselves. All I had to do was wait for gravity. 3 days after filing that notice, I walked into the office to find my badge access downgraded and my entire archive shelf labeled Team Review in Progress. My files, years of physical evidence, the binders that had built our government portfolio, boxed up and gone. No email, no request, not even a heads up, just a sticky note signed BM. I stood there in the hollow space where my life's work used to sit and took a slow breath. Federal compliance isn't dramatic, it's surgical. You wait for the incision to open on its own. Blake thought he'd buried me. He didn't realize he'd just left fingerprints all over a federal chain of custody. That night, I stayed after hours, scrolling through the Federal Acquisition Regulation database until my eyes burned. And there it was, the buried clause I remembered from years ago, 4.3b. B. Removal of a registered contracting officer without formal federal reassignment shall trigger automatic audit review within 10 business days. A clause so obscure even half the lawyers I trained didn't know it existed. It wasn't revenge, it was procedure. I opened a new document on my desktop, Audit Trigger Documentation.docx. Then another, Access Revocation Log, XLSX. I filled them line by line, recording every timestamp, every unauthorized edit, every maintenance suspension message I'd received since Blake's takeover. Each entry was a breadcrumb leading directly to his door. At 8:41 p.m., I logged into the federal portal again. My credentials still worked. In the government's eyes, I was still the contracting officer of record. The company might have erased me internally, but the federal system hadn't caught up, and that gap was my window. I navigated to the $480 million logistics contract and typed out my second notice. Internal reassignment executed without corresponding federal notification. Requesting compliance verification and audit review per subsection 4.3b. As of this filing, contract currently lacks an authorized oversight officer. I read it 3 times before clicking Submit. The system blinked, time-stamped 20:07 EST, and responded, Review cycle initiated. That was it. No fireworks, no sirens. Just bureaucracy. Quiet, relentless, irreversible. The machine had started moving. I printed every confirmation page, every portal screenshot, and added them to my binder. I labeled it in fresh ink. Morrison Incident. Federal Audit Prep. Then I slid it into my locked drawer beside an old mug that read, Trust me, I'm compliant. The next morning, I sipped coffee at my new cubicle, wedged between the supply closet and the window facing a brick wall, while Blake strutted through the office announcing new agile processes. He'd given access to half a dozen interns and junior analysts who couldn't tell a FAR clause from a breakfast menu. I could have warned him. I didn't. By now, the clock was already ticking. 7 business days left. He sent out another company-wide email. Compliance reimagined. A new era. I almost laughed. Compliance isn't reimagined, it's codified in law. But he didn't understand that. He thought rules bent for people who smiled big in conference calls. I watched him parade around the boardroom like a Silicon Valley messiah, convinced he'd revolutionized government contracting. I knew what was really coming. Somewhere, a team of federal auditors had just received a trigger notice with his name attached. They were already reviewing logs, planning visits, sharpening pencils, and when they came, it wouldn't be an email. It would be 3 people in gray suits and government badges stepping out of an elevator without warning. They never schedule appointments. They just appear. So I waited, quietly, adding one more tab to my binder. Anticipated audit timeline. 6 business days left. Tick. Tuesday morning came like any other. Stale coffee, 2 bright fluorescent lights, and the faint smell of burnt toast from the intern's toaster. Then a facilities Slack ping popped up on my screen. Hey Dana, did you know there are feds in the building? My pulse didn't even flicker. Oh, I knew. The audit clock had hit 0. I leaned back in my chair and took one slow sip as three figures in gray suits exited the elevator like omens in tailored wool. Two federal auditors and one compliance enforcement officer, each holding black folios like they contained the 10 Commandments of accountability. They didn't look around or ask directions. They already knew exactly where to go. The boardroom. I followed quietly, clipboard in hand, looking like a harmless bystander. Blake was already there, shirt untucked on one side, sleeves rolled. That same ridiculous vape tucked behind his ear like a marker of confidence he hadn't earned. He clapped his hands together. "All right, welcome. Bit of a surprise audit, huh? Keeps us sharp," he said, flashing the kind of grin that only ever precedes disaster. The lead auditor, a woman whose posture could have cut glass, didn't smile. She opened her folio. "We're here to review oversight documentation for federal contract DLS 48023. Blake nodded too fast. Absolutely. You'll find everything's been optimized. We've transitioned to a lean compliance framework, reduced red tape, all very forward-thinking." Her eyes didn't even lift. "Who is the registered contracting officer for this file?" Blake blinked. It was the kind of blink that said he hadn't prepared for a question that basic. Me, I guess?" The auditor finally looked up, slow and surgical. "You guess?" He let out a laugh a beat too late. "No, yes. Me. I was assigned oversight during restructuring. Was that reassignment filed with the Federal Oversight Agency and verified per subsection 4.3b within 5 business days?" she asked. Blake's thumb began tapping his ring finger, his nervous tell. "Well, we, notified legal, I think." The auditor raised a hand, just enough to silence him. "That's not what I asked. Was the reassignment filed and verified?" The silence was nuclear. Blake turned to our general counsel, Martha Cruz, who'd arrived late and was riffling through papers like she'd just stumbled into someone else's trial. The auditor continued, calm and lethal. "As of this morning, the registry still lists Dana Ellison as the last verified contracting officer. No reassignment accepted, no transfer completed." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Blake laughed again, too loud. "I'm sure it's a timing issue. The paperwork is probably—" "The federal record does not operate on probably," she said evenly. "It operates on timestamps." She set her pen down. "Until reassignment is confirmed, this contract has no federally authorized oversight." Blake blinked, still not catching on. "So what does that mean? Like a small delay, or—" "No," she said flatly, closing her folio. "This file is now classified as non-compliant. All activities under this contract are frozen pending full review." The words hit like a freight train. The boardroom went dead silent. HR stopped typing. Legal's jaw went slack. The logistics manager looked like he might faint. I stood quietly near the back wall, pretending to take notes. Blake's tapping had stopped. Both his hands now lay flat on the table, white-knuckled. The auditor reached into her folio again and withdrew a single sheet. Government seal. Thick stock paper. Every inch radiating authority. She slid it across the table to Martha, who stared like it might bite her. "What's this?" Martha asked softly. The auditor's tone didn't change. "It's the internal removal form authorizing the termination of Dana Ellison as contracting officer. Signed by you. Countersigned by HR. Dated 8 business days ago." Blake's throat clicked. The silence that followed was pure gravity. Martha's eyes darted over the document, her lips parting just slightly as she reread the bolded line near the bottom. You could almost hear the blood drain from her face. At the end of the page, in clear federal language, it stated, "Per FAR subsection 4.3b, removal of a registered contracting officer without federal reassignment renders all contract activity unauthorized until reassignment is verified." Translation: Blake's signature had just transformed a $480 million logistics contract into a federal liability. Every invoice, every shipment, every vendor payment executed under his modernized framework now had the legal standing of a doodle on a napkin. Martha finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "Oh my God." Blake leaned over, trying for that same fake composure he used in presentations. "Wait, can't we just file it now? Like a retroactive update? Nobody needs to know, right?" The lead auditor's head tilted slightly, her tone still calm, but slicing through the air like a scalpel. Backdating a federal reassignment constitutes document falsification. That's a felony offense under 18 U.S.C. AO 1001. The intern at the far end quietly closed her laptop, hands trembling. Blake turned to Martha, voice rising. "You said we needed to move fast. You said we'd clean up the paperwork later." Martha didn't even blink. "I said we needed a verified chain of custody. You said, quote, just do the form. You locked Dana out of the system without clearance confirmation. It was just internal process noise," he insisted. "We're not talking about national security here." The auditor's gaze was steady. "Sir, the Department of Defense considers oversight of this magnitude national security." That sentence landed like a gavel. No one moved. The finance director at the table slowly shut his laptop. Another executive discreetly began typing on her phone, probably texting her attorney. Blake's breath hitched. "So what? You're freezing $500 million over a clerical misunderstanding?" The auditor didn't blink. Not a misunderstanding. A breach. All activity under contract DLS 48023 is suspended pending full investigation. Any continued transactions may constitute federal fraud. The room stayed utterly still. I stood by the window, my clipboard perfectly still in my hands, heart steady, eyes neutral. I'd imagined this moment 100 times, not for vengeance, but for clarity. Bureaucracy doesn't need to shout. It crushes with silence. The agent turned toward Blake again. "Who authorized the operational changes you made after the reassignment?" Me, I guess," he stammered. "But legal was in the loop." Martha shook her head. "No. We were told you'd cleared it through the agency. But I sent emails," he snapped. "Internal," she said. "Not federal. Those are two different universes." Blake's face flushed beet red. He looked around the table like a drowning man searching for a rope. "You can't just shut this down over one name." The auditor's reply was surgical. "Not a name, a role. Federal compliance isn't decorative, it's jurisdictional." Then she packed up her papers, motioned to her team, and said, "We'll be collecting documentation, internal communications, and access logs for the last 30 days. She glanced briefly at me, her expression unreadable, then added, "All correspondence related to the officer removal will be reviewed." Blake slumped into his chair like his bones had dissolved. No one spoke. Even the hum of the air vent seemed to fade. When the auditors left, it was as if gravity returned to the room in pieces. First sound, then motion, then panic. Martha turned slowly toward Blake. "Please tell me you didn't sign this without a verified replacement," she said, voice trembling but lethal. Blake blinked, uncomprehending. "What? I thought that's what the restructure covered." "You thought?" Martha's tone cut through him. "You've potentially triggered a federal breach. We could lose the entire contract portfolio." Blake finally looked toward the door where the auditors had exited, and for the first time, I saw it, the crack in his confidence. It wasn't panic yet, just the beginning of realization. The silence in that boardroom was the kind that changes temperature. Thick, airless, humming with the sound of careers quietly ending. Blake swallowed hard, sweat glinting above his upper lip. "Okay," he stammered. "So, We'll just fix it. File the reassignment today. Get Dana back in the loop, whatever it takes. Martha shook her head slowly, her voice like cold glass. You can't file it now. The auditors already logged the timestamp. Any attempt to backdate or alter the record is tampering. But I didn't mean to break anything, he protested. Intent doesn't matter, she said. Federal oversight doesn't care about your intentions, only your compliance. Across the table, one of the finance directors let out a shaky breath. What happens now? The question hung in the air like a confession. The auditor, still seated, her badge glinting in the overhead light, answered evenly. Until the reassignment is processed through the federal system, the contract is considered non-executable. That includes deliverables, invoices, vendor payments, and interagency communications. You mean everything stops? Blake said, voice cracking. Yes, she replied simply. Everything stops. The weight of it hit the room all at once. Millions in pending shipments, months of work, entire departments, all frozen because one man thought federal clearance was a formality. I stood still in the corner, clipboard pressed to my chest, watching the unraveling. The CEO wasn't there yet. He was still in D.C., probably on a flight back from his latest photo op with congressional partners. But his absence only made the tension worse. Everyone was waiting for someone else to speak, to explain, to save them. No one could. Blake dropped into his chair, rubbing his temples like the headache was external. So, you're telling me the government just shuts down a $500 million contract over one missing signature? The auditor didn't blink. Not missing. Invalid. You removed the only federally authorized officer and replaced her with someone unverified. That voided the oversight chain. The system is functioning exactly as designed. Martha leaned in, voice low and trembling now. You've just jeopardized our entire compliance record, Blake. This isn't a PR problem. It's a federal one. His face paled. But I can fix it. I'll file it right now. Make the case that it was an internal oversight. The auditor stood, interrupting him mid-sentence. Stop. Do not alter or submit any documentation until instructed. The file is under audit lock. Any change would be considered interference. That last word hung sharp as a blade. Blake's mouth opened, then closed again. His confidence, that smooth armor of corporate charisma, had finally cracked. The interns avoided eye contact. The legal counsel's hands were shaking so hard, her pen rattled against the table. Then the door burst open. The CEO strode in. Thomas Redding, red-faced, still clutching his phone, tie askew, one AirPod dangling from his ear. What the hell is going on? He barked. No one answered. The auditor calmly approached and handed him the printed removal record. Mr. Redding, she said, this document reflects the unauthorized removal of Ms. Dana Ellison as the registered contracting officer of record, dated 8 business days ago, without federal reassignment. As a result, your DLS 48U23 contract is now classified as non-compliant. All activities under this file are frozen pending review. Thomas read the first 2 lines, stopped, then read them again. His face went from red to white in real time. Slowly, he turned toward Blake, who sat slouched in his chair like a man awaiting sentencing. You did what? The CEO said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. Blake opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Thomas set the paper on the table like it was radioactive. You removed the officer without reassignment? Blake's silence was his confession. The CEO leaned back, eyes hollow. You just froze $500 million of government funding. The room felt colder after that, like the air itself had given up. No one dared move. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to dim. Blake tried to form words, his voice cracking through the silence. It was just supposed to be an efficiency thing, he muttered weakly. We were trying to streamline. Streamline? The CEO interrupted, his tone slicing through him like a razor. You streamlined us into a federal breach. Thomas's voice didn't rise beyond a steady, dangerous quiet, but that made it worse. He turned to the auditor. What happens now? She closed her folio, her face unreadable. A full compliance investigation. All federal disbursements are on hold until review is complete. Will require access to all internal correspondence related to the officer's removal. Emails, messages, system logs. She looked at Blake for a beat longer than necessary. Including your directives. Blake's mouth opened, then closed again. The color had drained from his face completely. The auditor gave a polite nod to the CEO. We'll be in touch. Then she and her team gathered their files and left the room in silence. The door shut with the finality of a gavel. Thomas didn't speak right away. He just sat, staring at the document on the table, his jaw tightening. Then slowly, he turned his gaze back to Blake. Do you understand what you've done? Blake shifted in his seat. We can fix it, he said quietly. We'll call the agency, explain it was an internal. You can't fix this, Thomas cut in. You signed a federal record without authorization. You've jeopardized every single contract we have with the government. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. Do you realize they could pull all of it? Not just this one, the entire portfolio. Martha, still seated beside him, spoke for the first time in minutes. And any attempt to backdate a correction is a felony. We're already past the audit clock. The words fell heavy. Everyone knew what that meant. Enforcement, not review. Thomas leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with an exhausted calm. Blake, leave your badge and laptop on the table. Blake blinked. What? Effective immediately. You're suspended pending legal review. The VP looked around the room like a man trying to find a single friendly face. None looked back. You can't just... Out, Thomas said quietly. Blake stood, shaky, pale, his bravado gone. He fumbled his badge onto the table, muttered something under his breath, and walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Thomas rubbed his temples again and turned to Martha. Get legal on the phone. We're going to need to prepare a full disclosure packet before the auditors request it. Martha nodded silently. And find Dana, he added after a pause. Now. But I was already standing in the doorway. I'd slipped in quietly while they were arguing, binder in hand. You don't need to find me, I said calmly. Thomas looked up, startled. Dana? You're still here? Always, I replied. I set the binder on the table and slid it toward him. The label read, Audit Trigger Documentation, Verified. Inside were every screenshot, timestamp, and federal confirmation since Blake's unauthorized reassignment. You'll want this, I said. It's already logged in the system. Thomas opened the first page and exhaled. The word satisfactory was stamped in black across the top. You filed it, he murmured. Of course, I said evenly. It's my job. He nodded slowly, the faintest flicker of relief crossing his face. You just saved us from something worse. I shrugged. I didn't save you. The regulations did. I just respected them. I turned to leave. Dana! Thomas called. I stopped at the doorway. What do you want? I thought about it. A fresh coffee pot. And an office with a door. Then I left. The audit report arrived 2 weeks later. The summary was simple. Non-compliance resolved. Corrective measures satisfactory. No medals, no speech, no credit. Just a single word in an email that made every late night worth it. Satisfactory. For 17 years, they'd called me old school, outdated, a relic of bureaucracy. But when the dust settled, my silence had done what their noise never could. It saved the company.